The night the men came for her, the neon sign out front was half burned out, and the rain on the highway sounded like distant applause. 3 black SUVs rolled into the parking lot of the roadside diner, engines still rumbling when the doors flew open. 4 large men in dark jackets stepped out first, moving like they'd rehearsed it. Behind them, a younger guy in a tailored coat adjusted his glasses, scanned the booths through the glass, and locked eyes with her. Ingrid Hale. He called, pushing through the door as the bell chimed weakly. "My name is Ethan Cole. I work for you." Carl Harper was already moving before his brain caught up. He slid out from behind the counter, one hand on his son's shoulder, the other wrapping around the handle of a cast-iron skillet, still warm from the grill. 3 other men were already inside, wrong kinds of jackets, wrong kinds of boots, eyes sweeping the diner like they owned the place. One of them flicked his coat back just enough for Carl to see the outline of a gun. Ingrid shrank back in the corner booth, fingers white around her sketchbook, eyes glued to the floor. "Ma'am," Ethan said, stepping between her and the men with the guns, his security team fanning out to block the aisle. "You've been missing for 6 months. Your uncle doesn't own you. You're not crazy. And you're not alone anymore." The whole diner went silent. The fryers hissed. The clock above the coffee pots ticked too loud. Carl tightened his grip on the skillet, felt his son's small fingers dig into the back of his apron, and realized he was standing dead center between a billionaire no one knew about, a lawyer with hired muscle, and a group of men who clearly weren't here for pie. "Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight. And hit that like and subscribe button if you believe courage still matters in this world." Now, to understand how a 38-year-old short-order cook ended up in the middle of all that, we've got to go back to a very normal Tuesday night on Interstate 40. Carl Harper worked the graveyard shift at the Lone Star Diner 20 miles outside Amarillo, Texas. To the truckers, he was just cook. To the regulars, he was the quiet guy who kept the coffee fresh and the jukebox low. Nobody at the counter knew he'd once worn a different uniform, that he'd spent a decade in the Army figuring out how to keep things from blowing up, diffusing explosives with hands that never shook. That was before the rollover, before the phone call from the hospital 3 states away, before he held his wife's hand as the machines beeped slower and slower after a drunk driver tore through a red light and tore his life in half. These days, his world was smaller. The hiss of the grill, the squeak of vinyl booths. His 10-year-old son, Mason, sprawled in the back booth after homework drawing superheroes on napkins, while his dad refilled truckers' plates. Money was tight. The old Silverado drank gas like water. The rent on their little 2-bedroom over-the-tire shop went up every spring. But Carl showed up every night, every shift, because showing up was all he had left to prove to himself, to his boy, that he could still protect what mattered. He didn't talk much about the past, didn't talk much at all, really. What he did was listen. To the lonely drivers, to the waitresses juggling bills and exes, and eventually to the quiet young woman who started showing up at 2:00 a.m., sitting in the last booth by the window, ordering nothing but hot tea and a plain baked potato she never finished. The first time she came in, she flinched at the sound of a plate breaking in the kitchen. The second time, he noticed the edge of a bruise near her collar, half hidden under her scarf. The third time, when she turned her face just right, he saw something else, old confidence buried under fresh fear. She didn't speak. Not once. She wrote her order on a sticky note, slid it toward him with shaking hands, then clutched a worn leather sketchbook like it was life support. He started slipping her extra bacon, then a slice of pie by mistake. Then, on a night when the wind screamed across the plains and the diner was all but empty, He told Mason to bring her an extra hot chocolate on the house. That was the night he saw headlights pause at the edge of the lot just a little too long. The night he realized her eyes didn't track the waitress, or the truckers, or even him. They tracked the door. Always the door. And when he walked out back later to dump the trash and found a ripped photograph by the dumpster, a photo of her smiling in some fancy city rooftop garden with a man's arm around her, and a date stamped from last year, Carl, Harper understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whoever she wasn't just another late-night customer. And if she kept coming back to his diner sooner or later, her past was going to walk through that front door and test just how much of a protector he still knew how to be. The diner never really slept, but around 3:00 a.m., when the truckers thinned out and the jukebox hummed low, Carl felt a kind of fragile quiet settle over the place. It was during that quiet, on a Thursday, 2 weeks after Ingrid first showed fear at the door, that the trouble really began. A group of local sheriff's deputies had drifted in for their usual late-night breakfast, the kind paid with county cards and careless tips. They filled a booth near the window, Boots' muddy radios crackling on their shoulders. Carl didn't think much of it at first. Cops coming in at night was nothing new. They complained about paperwork and left him with dishes dirtier than the plates. But tonight was different. They kept staring subtle, at first glancing over at Ingrid as she hunched in her usual corner booth, hands wrapped around her mug. She wasn't even drawing this time. She looked too tired for that. Mason had fallen asleep beside the pass-through window, curled up on a pile of folded aprons. Carl felt the shift before he heard a word. One deputy, a tall man with a bulldog jaw, nudged his partner. "That's her," he muttered, not nearly quiet enough. "Same girl from the bulletin last month, except the flyer said mentally unstable. Wanders off, maybe dangerous." His partner grinned. "Looks harmless enough, unless she bites." They laughed under their breath. Something cold slid down Carl's spine. He came out from behind the counter and approached their booth with a coffee pot, pretending not to have heard. "Refill?" he asked. The bulldog-faced deputy leaned back, eyeing Carl like he was gum on a boot heel. "You know who you're harboring?" "Harper." Carl kept his voice even. "Just a customer." "That so?" The man smirked and took out his phone. "'Cause my sergeant said there's a report of a missing person female, mid-20s, unstable family trying to bring her home. Says she's been popping up around here. And this girl?" He gestured toward Ingrid. "Sure fits the picture." Carl poured coffee slowly, careful not to let his hand tremble. "She's not causing trouble." "That's not up to you." The deputy's gaze sharpened. "What's up with her? Why doesn't she talk? You letting psychos wander in your diner now with your kid around?" Carl bristled, jaw tightening. "She's not a threat." "You sure?" the deputy said, eyebrows raised. "Or is this about pity folks like her? You never know. Could snap, break a window, hurt somebody. Wouldn't be the first time some vagrant pretended to be harmless." Mason stirred in his sleep at the edge in the man's voice. Carl's heart thudded once hard. The deputy noticed and smirked like he'd won something. "Relax, Harper. We're just doing our job. But if she's still hanging around like this, we might have to bring her in for evaluation. Just a little 48-hour psych hold. Make sure she's safe. Make sure you're safe." Carl's stomach twisted. They weren't being gentle. They weren't offering help. They were circling her like hyenas who'd scented weakness. He forced a polite nod, then went back behind the counter. But Ingrid had heard enough. Her hands shook as she scribbled something on her sticky notepad. She slid it toward Carl when he passed. "I'll go. Don't let them take me." He shook his head, once firm, no hesitation, then walked away before the deputies could read the exchange. But the fear in her eyes stuck to him like burrs. An hour later, when the deputies finally left one of them, paused at the door and tossed a final barb over his shoulder. "Keep an eye on your charity case. Would hate to see the kid caught in the crossfire." Carl's fists tightened around a dish towel. He didn't say a word. Couldn't trust himself to. When they were gone, the diner felt hollowed out. Ingrid packed up her sketchbook with trembling fingers, humming under her breath like she was trying to anchor herself. Mason rubbed his eyes and stumbled over, sensing the quiet tension. "Dad." "What happened, Carl?" Knelt beside him. "Nothing you need to worry about, buddy." But Mason wasn't fooled. He looked at Ingrid, then back at the door the deputies had walked through. His voice came out small. "They don't like her, do they?" Carl swallowed hard. "Some folks judge what they don't understand. That's all." Ingrid's eyes watered at that, and she pulled out her pad. "I should leave." Mason shook his head so fast his hair flopped. "No. You're our friend." His voice cracked. "They shouldn't talk like that about you." Carl wished he could shield both of them from this ugliness. But the world had teeth, and now those teeth were turning in their direction. In the days that followed, the pressure built like steam behind a locked door. Truckers who never cared now whispered about the weird girl always hiding in the corner. Regulars Carl had served for years started asking uncomfortable questions. One woman said her husband wouldn't come in anymore because that mute girl gives him the creeps. Another claimed she saw Ingrid sketching pictures of customers like it was evidence of something deviant. None of it was true. But rumors didn't need truth. They just needed momentum. And momentum, once it started rolling, crushed everything in its path. Carl tried to keep her safe. He brought her tea. He sat with her on breaks. He let her stay late cleaning up just so she wouldn't have to walk home alone in the dark. But every kind act seemed to increase the hostile stares. One night, a group of teenagers came in from the highway, loud, half-drunk, daring each other. They spotted Ingrid almost instantly. "Hey, is she deaf or just stupid?" one called across the diner. Carl stood up straight behind the counter. "Knock it off," he said, firm but measured. The kid laughed. "Oh, come on. I'm just trying to figure out what language she speaks. Maybe it's alien. You think she understands English?" He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted exaggeratedly, "Do! You need help." Ingrid froze, shoulders curled, staring at her plate like she could disappear into it. The kids snickered. One mimed drawing in a sketchbook, mocking her movements. Carl's stomach burned like acid. But the diner had rules. Management was strict about not starting confrontations. He needed this job to keep Mason fed. Still, he walked over and said, "That's enough. Eat or get out." The lead kid scoffed. "What's your deal, man? You sweet on her or something?" Carl didn't rise to it, didn't give them what they wanted. He just kept his eyes steady and unmoving until they finally dragged themselves out, muttering about how the diner used to be fun. But the damage was done. When the door slammed shut behind them, Ingrid slowly lifted her sticky note. "I am so sorry." Carl shook his head. "You don't apologize for other people's bad manners." But her eyes stayed down tears, slipping silently down her cheeks. And in the booth nearby, Mason watched her cry with a look Carl had hoped he'd never see on his son's face, the helpless anger of a child watching cruelty he can't stop. Things reached a boiling point on a Saturday night. A storm swept across the plains, rattling the windows and making the sign outside flicker. Only a few customers braved the weather. The diner was quieter than usual. Too quiet. Carl was wiping down the grill when a sleek black sedan pulled in unusual out there, far too polished for a roadside joint. A well-dressed man stepped out, umbrella snapping open above him. He walked like he owned the ground. Not a trucker, not a local, someone important trying not to look like he cared about being seen. He came inside rain, tapping his shoulders. His eyes landed on Ingrid instantly. "There you are," he said, relief and reproach tangled in his voice. She went pale as parchment. Carl moved instinctively, stepping between them before he even understood why. "Sir," he said carefully, "she's eating. If you need something, you can talk to me first." The man blinked at him, stunned at being challenged. Then his expression shifted into something colder, superior. "And who exactly are you?" he asked. "Someone trying to give her a little peace." "Peace?" The man scoffed. "Do you know how long we've been looking for her? What she's put us through? The trouble she's caused?" He was speaking loudly enough that the remaining customers were staring now. Carl kept his voice low. "Maybe take it down a notch." The man leaned in slightly. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, or what she is." He said, "What not, who?" That was when Carl saw Ingrid sinking into her seat, hands trembling, eyes pleading silently. Mason walked out from the kitchen doorway, stopping short at the tension. His gaze darted from his dad to Ingrid to the stranger. The man noticed the boy and smirked. "Bad enough you shelter her, but you let your kid near her too." He shook his head. "Some people shouldn't be parents." Carl didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't move. But something inside him cracked clean in half. For a moment, the diner felt too small, the walls too close, the air too thin. The stranger continued, voice icy. "She needs to come with me, now. You've done enough damage." Carl glanced at Ingrid. She was shaking her head. Tiny, terrified shakes. Mason stepped closer to his father, eyes wide. Carl knew this was the moment a man chooses who he's going to be, the moment pressure becomes action. He dried his hands slowly on a towel, then stepped forward just enough that the stranger had to tilt his chin up to hold eye contact. "I think," Carl said quietly, "you need to leave." The stranger stared at him, incredulous. Lightning flashed outside, the rain intensified, and somewhere deep in Carl's chest the storm finally met its match. Something big was coming, bigger than insults, bigger than rumors, bigger than the stranger who suddenly realized he wasn't the only one in the room who knew how to stand his ground. And the next move would change everything. The stranger didn't budge. He stood there in his expensive coat, rain dripping from the hem, looking at Carl like a man who'd never once been told no in his life. The diner lights flickered with the storm as if the whole building were holding its breath. Ingrid clutched her sketchbook to her chest, eyes darting between the two men already bracing for the worst. And Mason, small and silent beside his father, tightened his jaw, the way kids do when they're trying not to cry. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains. Inside, something far more dangerous began to rumble. The man took a step closer to Ingrid. "Get your things," he ordered. "You're coming with me." "This situation," he flicked a disdainful glance at Carl, "has gone on long enough." Carl shifted his weight, placing himself directly in the man's path. "Last time," he said. "Leave." The stranger's smile turned razor thin. "You think you can stop what's coming? You're just a cook in a dying diner. You're nothing." The words landed like slaps, sharp and practiced. Maybe on another night they would have stung. But tonight, with his son watching and Ingrid trembling like a trapped bird, something deeper lit in Carl, an old instinct that had nothing to do with cooking and everything to do with survival. Before he could answer, headlights swept across the windows. Another car pulled in, then another. The stranger's expression changed. Not fear, certainty. He glanced toward the door. "They're here." The bell over the entrance jingled as 3 men entered the diner, each wearing the same tailored look as the stranger. They didn't bother shaking off the rain. They spread out, blocking the exits, scanning the booths with cold precision. One of them nodded toward Ingrid. "Found her." The air turned electric. Carl felt Mason's fingers slip into his, the kind of quiet gesture only a child who trusts completely will make. Ingrid pushed her back against the booth, shrinking into herself, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The stranger exhaled as if relieved. "This ends now. She comes with us." The room tilted slightly, like the world had shifted 1 inch off its axis. Carl could hear the storm outside, the rusty hum of the soda machine, Mason's heartbeat against his arm, and somewhere deep in his chest, another heartbeat, one he hadn't heard in years, began to pulse again. He saw a flash of a memory. His wife lying in a hospital bed, pale as moonlight, her hand slipping from his, and the vow he'd whispered against her knuckles, shaking with grief. "I won't fail him. I won't fail anyone you love ever again." Now the memory rose up with the force of a tidal wave. He stepped forward. "Stay behind me," he told Mason and Ingrid. The men exchanged looks, amused. One said, "This is unnecessary. Move." Carl didn't. The first man reached out to shove him aside. A mistake. Carl pulled him forward with a pivot, using the man's own momentum to slam him into the counter. The sound echoed through the diner like a cannon shot. The other two lunged, but Carl moved faster than they calculated, faster than a man who flipped burgers for a living should have been able to. The second man reached for something under his coat. Carl reacted instantly, grabbing a metal napkin holder and slamming it against the man's wrist. The object clattered to the floor, a stun baton, not a gun, but enough to incapacitate someone. The third man rushed him from the side, grabbing his shirt. Carl drove an elbow into his ribs, twisted the man's arm behind his back, and shoved him into a booth so hard the table rattled. The stranger watched in shock, his confidence draining like water from a cracked glass. Mason's eyes were wide, but not with fear, with awe. Ingrid covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming as she watched the chaos unfolding. A crash sounded behind the counter, one of the men trying to get back up. Carl spun, swept a hand across the prep station, and sent a stack of heavy ceramic plates shattering at the man's feet, forcing him to stumble back. The leader shouted, "Enough!" But Carl wasn't listening anymore. He wasn't the quiet fry cook. He wasn't the widower scraping by. He wasn't the man who'd spent years pretending he was broken beyond use. He was the man who'd once disarmed explosives with seconds left. He was the man who'd held dying soldiers and still moved forward. He was the man who'd vowed never again to freeze while someone needed him. This time, he didn't freeze. One of the men lunged again, desperation now, not control. Carl dodged, swept the guy's legs out from under him, and pinned him to the floor with a knee between the shoulder blades. The stranger backed up and raised his voice, cracking. All right, stop, just stop." Carl didn't ease up until he saw the man was truly surrendering. Behind him, the storm rattled the windows like applause. Ingrid sobbed his name, soft, disbelieving. Mason whispered, "Dad, I didn't know you could do that." Carl looked at his son, then, heart in his throat, soaked in sweat and rain and fear. "I don't like doing it," he said softly. "But sometimes you fight to protect what matters." The stranger swallowed hard. "You don't understand, she's not safe out here. She's worth millions in assets, and she's unstable, and she's a human being," Carl snapped. "And she's not going anywhere with you." The words seemed to knock the wind out of the stranger. He hesitated. Then, something unexpected happened. For the first time, Carl saw fear on the man's face. Real fear. "You don't know the kind of people looking for her," the stranger said, voice shaking. "You think we're the worst thing that could walk through that door?" "You have no idea." Carl felt the truth behind those words like a cold shiver down his spine. Another layer to this mess. Another threat lurking somewhere beyond the rain. But he couldn't afford to think about that now. He kept one hand up defensively while dialing 911 with the other. The operator answered, and Carl's voice was steady when he said, "I need sheriff's units at the Lone Star Diner. Now. Men attempting to abduct a guest. Send backup." The stranger's shoulders sagged. He didn't fight anymore. He just stared at Carl like he'd never seen him before. Within minutes, sirens cut through the storm. But before law enforcement arrived, something critical happened in the silence between them. Mason slipped his small hand into Ingrid's. She gripped it like it was the last solid thing on earth. Carl saw it, and it carved something deep and permanent into him. The police burst in moments later, guns drawn, shouting orders. They saw 3 men pinned or stunned, a 4th raising his hands, and Carl standing tall in the middle of it all. Officers grabbed the intruders. The stranger tried to speak, but the deputies silenced him. The stunned, half-conscious men were cuffed and hauled out into the rain. The sheriff approached Carl. "What the hell happened here?" Carl didn't answer right away. He looked at Ingrid, pale, shaking, but for the first time not alone. He looked at Mason, brave, proud, still clutching Ingrid's hand. Then he finally spoke. "They tried to take her," he said simply. "I wasn't going to let that happen." The sheriff stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. And in that nod, something shifted. Respect, recognition, a quiet understanding of what real courage looks like. The officers led the men away. The diner slowly returned to stillness. But nothing was the same. Carl had crossed a line he could never uncross. He'd revealed more of himself than he ever meant to. And now, whether he liked it or not, the entire world around him, Ingrid's world especially, was about to tilt into something far more dangerous, far more complicated, and far more revealing than anything he had prepared for. Because heroism isn't just one moment. It's what comes after. And the truth, whatever it was finally coming. Rainwater pooled around the entrance as the last patrol car pulled away, its taillights dissolving into the storm. The Lone Star Diner felt strangely hollow after the chaos, as if the building itself were stunned. A few broken plates still lay in a corner, and one bar stool sat tilted on a single leg. Steam curled gently from the coffee pots untouched. Carl stood in the center of it all, breathing hard sweat and rain mixing down his temples. His hands still trembled with leftover adrenaline he tried to hide. Ingrid sat in the corner booth where everything had started clutching her sketchbook like a life raft. Mason stayed glued to her side, refusing to leave her alone, even as exhaustion tugged at his eyes. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one of the deputies, the same one who'd mocked Carl days before, walked back inside, hat in hand. He didn't swagger this time. Didn't smirk. He looked at Carl with something like unease, maybe even respect. "Harper," he began, voice softer than Carl had ever heard it. "The guys we hauled out, they weren't amateurs. One of them's already lawyered up. They wouldn't say who they work for." Carl didn't answer. He didn't trust his voice not to shake. The deputy shifted, clearing his throat. "Look, I misjudged you earlier. Anyone can see that. You moved like someone who's been in a fight before, not like some line cook." Carl stared at him, jaw tight. He didn't owe this man explanations. He didn't owe him anything. But the deputy didn't push. He nodded awkwardly and stepped back outside, shutting the door gently behind him. Mason broke the silence first. "Dad, are you okay?" Carl crouched beside him, brushing wet hair from the boy's forehead. "Yeah, bud. I'm okay." Mason looked unconvinced, but he nodded. Ingrid watched them, eyes shining with something fragile and achingly tender. Then the bell above the door chimed again. A man stepped inside, a man Carl had never seen before. He wore a dark wool coat, tailored but not flashy, and carried himself with a certain sharpness, the kind built from boardrooms and courtrooms. He shook off the cold, scanned the diner, and his gaze landed on Ingrid. "Ingrid Hale," he said softly. "Thank God." She froze. Her breath hitched. And then, with trembling hands, she opened her sketchbook and held it up. A single page torn from the back. A sketch of him. The man exhaled with relief. "You remember?" Carl straightened, muscles tensing again. "Who are you?" The stranger turned toward Carl, extending a hand in genuine gratitude. "My name is Evan Marwick. I'm Ingrid's attorney. I've been trying to find her for months." Carl didn't shake the hand. He wasn't ready for pleasantries. Evan didn't seem offended. He lowered his arm and spoke carefully. "I'm not here to take her from you. I'm here because her uncle will try again. And next time, he won't send men who are content to walk away in handcuffs." At the word uncle, Ingrid's shoulders curled in. She closed her eyes, her knuckles whitening. Evan continued, his voice thickening. "She disappeared 6 months ago. Her uncle claimed she'd had a breakdown, filed petitions, court orders, insisted she needed care. But something about it never sat right. Ingrid never had a history of mental instability. What she did have was sole controlling interest in her parents' estate. And her uncle's spending, well, it raised alarms." Carl felt the pieces falling into place with quiet dread. Evan stepped closer to the booth where Ingrid and Mason sat. "Your uncle wanted power, Ingrid. The kind he could only get if you were declared incompetent. When you vanished, I assumed he'd scared you into running. But tonight proves he's desperate and dangerous." Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away. Carl sat on the edge of the booth, trying to keep his voice gentler than he felt. "She's been terrified. Whoever was out there looking. It wasn't hard to tell they weren't coming to help her." Evan nodded. "No, they weren't." Then he turned to Carl, again studying him. "And you protected her. You protected both of them. You fought off trained men with nothing but instinct and whatever you had in your kitchen." His voice softened with respect. "Most people would have frozen. You didn't." Carl looked down quietly, wrestling with memories he kept buried. Freezing wasn't an option. "You've done this before," Evan said quietly. "Not a question. You're military." Carl didn't answer. He didn't need to. Mason looked between them, eyes wide. Ingrid reached out and touched Carl's sleeve gently, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to, or if she deserved to. That was when Evan opened his briefcase. Inside were papers, sealed envelopes, legal forms with embossed markings. He laid one on the table, turning it carefully so Ingrid could see. "This," he said, "is the real reason your uncle wants you under his thumb. Your parents set up a trust, massive, far-reaching, philanthropic. And when they passed, they left clear guardianship instructions. But they also left a second document, one I wasn't allowed to reveal until after your 25th birthday." He tapped the envelope. "Your mother chose who would have emergency control of the estate if anything ever happened to you." Ingrid's breath caught. Carl felt his heart thud hard. Evan's eyes flicked toward him with quiet gravity. She chose someone she believed would never misuse power. Someone with integrity above everything else. The room seemed to shrink around them as he slid the document across the table. Carl stared at it, not daring to touch it. Evan nodded once. "Carl, your name is on it." For a moment, the world stopped moving. Carl blinked, thinking he misheard. "What? No, that can't. Why would... Because your wife?" Evan said softly, served with Ingrid's mother 20 years ago. They were close. She wrote letters about you, about who you were as a soldier, as a man. She trusted you. The floor tilted. The lights blurred. Carl gripped the table to stay grounded. Ingrid covered her mouth, tears falling freely now. Mason looked up at his father in astonished silence. Carl's voice broke when he finally spoke. "She never told me. Not once." "No," Evan said gently. "She didn't. The trust was sealed. But your wife described you as the only man she ever met who could be trusted with something bigger than himself, something pure. She wrote that if anything happened to Ingrid's parents, and then to Ingrid, you were the only one she believed wouldn't be swayed by money or power." Carl shook his head. "I'm a diner cook. I barely make rent." Evan's tone softened. "Which is exactly why they trusted you." The role reversal was almost painful. The same deputies who'd mocked Carl earlier now milled awkwardly near the doorway, avoiding eye contact. The stranger's hired men sat cuffed outside in the rain, heads bowed. And Ingrid, who'd been treated like a broken ghost, looked at Carl with a kind of reverence gratitude so deep it hurt. Evan slid another document toward them. "Your position gives you one immediate responsibility. Decide what happens next. If you walk away, Ingrid goes into protective federal custody. If you stay involved..." He took a breath. "Then you help guide the estate until Ingrid can legally reclaim it, and you'll be responsible for shielding her from the people who want to control her." Carl looked at Mason, who stared back with wide, pleading eyes. He looked at Ingrid, whose whole body trembled with hope and fear mixed into something fragile and raw. He looked at the trust documents still untouched. His life had been simple, small, predictable, but nothing about the woman sitting in his booth, nor the world hunting her, was small. Evan stepped back, giving him room. "Carl, this isn't a job. It's a burden, a dangerous one. But it's also a chance to do something good, something your wife believed you could do." That hit harder than any blow thrown in the diner. Carl felt the weight of years pressing on him. Grief, guilt, loneliness, the hollow ache of thinking he'd failed the one person who mattered most. And now, somehow, through a stranger's sketchbook and a stormy night, her voice returned to him in the form of this impossible responsibility. He took a long breath. Outside, lightning split the sky. Inside, Carl finally answered. "What do I need to do?" Evan nodded, almost relieved. "First, get both of them somewhere safe tonight. Then tomorrow we start the fight." Ingrid let out a soft, broken sound, half sob, half gratitude, and reached for Carl's hand. Mason wrapped his small arms around both of them, as if sealing the choice. And in that tight booth of a quiet Texas diner, something shifted permanently. The storm outside was still raging, but inside, a new storm was just beginning. The storm had barely eased when they stepped out of the diner, but the world around them already felt different. Deputies who had once dismissed Carl now lifted their hats respectfully as he walked Ingrid and Mason to Evan's car. One even muttered an apology he couldn't quite finish voice catching in his throat before he hurried away. The men who had burst into the diner earlier were loaded into separate cruisers, their confident expressions replaced with something smaller, rattled by the night's outcome. Ingrid stayed close to Carl, watching him with a mix of awe and disbelief that hadn't left her since her attorney revealed the truth. She held her sketchbook to her chest, like she finally understood it could be put down that someone else could carry the weight now. Mason clung to Carl's coat sleeve, still wide-eyed, but calmer, as though the world made a little more sense now that he knew the father he admired was bigger than the shadows he lived behind. They rode through the rain in silence, headed to a safe house Evan had arranged. By the time they reached it, an unremarkable ranch-style home on the edge of town, the storm had faded to a steady drizzle. Evan brought out warm blankets, hot drinks, and paperwork that could wait until morning. For the first time in months, Ingrid slept through the night. For the first time in years, Carl did too. The next morning came with a different kind of tension. Not fear, but purpose. News of the attempted abduction reached the county offices quickly. What Carl didn't expect was the sheriff himself stepping into the safe house kitchen, removing his hat like a man entering a church. "Harper," he said, voice steady. "You saved lives last night." He swallowed, choosing his next words carefully. "And I misjudged you. I'm sorry." Carl nodded, accepting it without bitterness. The sheriff left, looking relieved, as though the apology mattered more to him than the man receiving it. From there, things moved quickly. Evan assembled a team of investigators who gathered evidence against Ingrid's uncle. Court filings, financial records, false medical evaluations, each piece falling into place as if waiting for someone brave enough to push the first domino. Ingrid spent hours giving written statements, her hands shaking, but her resolve solid. Every time her confidence faltered, Carl placed a steady hand on the table beside her, and she'd straighten again. Within a week, federal agents arrived at her uncle's estate with warrants. By the end of the month, he was facing charges that would take the rest of his life to sort through. And through all of it, Carl stayed nearby, not because he was required to, but because it felt right. He'd spent so long believing he'd failed the one person he'd vowed to protect. Now, in this strange, unexpected way, he was honoring that promise. When the dust finally settled, Ingrid requested a formal meeting with the trustees handling her parents' estate. She wanted Carl present. At first, he sat stiffly at the long, polished table out of place among lawyers and financial advisors. But as conversations shifted from numbers to people, from investments to communities, something clicked. Carl talked about storefronts closing every month in their town, about single parents juggling bills, about veterans living 3 doors down from the diner with no access to mental health care. His voice stayed humble, but it carried weight. Evan leaned back in his chair, watching with a slow, proud smile. By the end of the meeting, it was Ingrid who made the most decisive statement of the day. She wrote a simple line on her notepad and slid it across to the board. Carl should help lead the community initiatives. They agreed without debate. For the first time since he'd left the service, Carl had a purpose that felt bigger than survival. Weeks turned into months. The Lone Star Diner repaired its cracked windows and replaced the broken plates. Locals who once muttered judgments now greeted Carl with nods of gratitude. Some apologized outright. Others simply left larger tips, which Carl never commented on. It didn't matter. People were learning. That was enough. Ingrid moved into a small brick house 2 streets over from Carl and Mason. Nothing fancy, just something warm, safe hers. She filled it with plants, sunlight, and sketches that no longer looked like cries for help, but like beginnings. Most mornings she showed up at the diner before sunrise, carrying a thermos of tea for Carl and a small breakfast treat for Mason. They'd sit in the quiet, before the world woke, trading warm looks and soft smiles that didn't need explanations. Carl stepped into his new role, gradually advising on grants for local projects, traveling with Evan to meet community leaders, and speaking at veteran outreach events without the tremor that once made him avoid the spotlight. Mason liked telling people that his dad helped fix towns, and Carl pretended he wasn't moved every time he heard it. By the end of the year, something unspoken had grown between the three of them. Not romance, not yet. Something more delicate, more powerful. A chosen closeness born from storms survived, and trust earned the hard way. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the Texas plains, they sat outside Carl's apartment, Mason drawing chalk superheroes on the sidewalk, while Carl and Ingrid watched from the steps. Fireflies flickered in the warm dusk. Ingrid scribbled something in her notebook, tore the page, and handed it to Carl. "Thank you for seeing me before anyone else did." Carl looked at her for a long moment before replying quietly, "You helped me see myself again." Her eyes glimmered in the fading light. Mason ran up then, chalk-covered and triumphant. "Look," he said, pointing to a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands. "That's us." Carl and Ingrid exchanged a smile that said more than any sketch could. They didn't correct him, because he wasn't wrong. In the months that followed, the town changed slowly, steadily. Funds restored programs, launched lives, quietly improved. And Carl Harper, once just a shadow behind a diner grill, became the kind of man people sought out when they needed clarity, steadiness, hope. He never bragged, never raised his voice, never tried to be anything more than what he was: a father, a protector, a man who showed up when it mattered. And maybe that's the truth. Older folks understand better than most heroism rarely looks like headlines or grand gestures. More often it looks like one person deciding not to look away when someone else is in danger. It looks like courage whispered instead of shouted. Some nights, long after the diner closed, Carl would stand outside under the quiet sweep of the stars, Mason asleep inside Ingrid's porch light, glowing down the street. And he'd feel something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Hard-won, simple, and real. Because sometimes after all the storms life sends your way, you find yourself surrounded by the people who stayed. And that, more than any title or trust or legacy, is what finally makes a place feel like home.